Hey, what's good, fam? Today's video is going to be the first part of a mini-series that I'm going to be releasing, which is talking about how I made My Beloved from my latest EP. Now, I won't be uploading the project file, but I will put the original loop, of which most of these drums sound like, in my Patreon, and you can check that out in the link in the description if you like. Before we get started, like and subscribe, blah blah blah. Okay, whatever, we're past that. Anyways, this is what you guys are looking for, so let's go ahead and have a listen to the drum sounds before we go any further. So it sounds like it's pretty complicated, and if you look at the amount of tracks that I have in my drum section, which spans all the way to here, then it seems like a lot, but I promise it's really not. Before we go any further, I want to pitch this workflow idea at you. Most of these drum sounds are from a combination of a loop that I've chopped up individually, and all it is just I've taken the individual samples from that loop, as you can see here, and then just made individual tracks for them. And the only thing that I've really done with those after that is add in maybe some EQ and then turn down the gain for gain staging. Which brings me to my first point. One of the most important things that I try to do is sound design outside of my composition projects, so to speak. So if you've watched the very first video that I've ever put up, I show you how to make drums like these, and all I do is I go and pull up an instance of Superior Drummer 3, and then I add a ton of distortion, compression, and EQ, etc., and then bounce out the entire loop. So from here, if I'm starting from fresh, what I'll do is I'll find that loop. I don't think that this is the actual loop, but I'll go in and I'll find whatever it is, and then I'll drag it onto one channel and then start cutting them individually. So the strategy behind this is it allows me to do what I like to do best, which is resampling. So from here, I can add in a lot of different variations because I'm working in audio. And it's very easy for me to just cut this part, duplicate it, double click on it, add in a different pitch or reverse it or whatever, and you get some really neat sounds from something that already sounds really good. And that's kind of like a very efficient and important workflow tip that I can give to you guys. The other option is you can just go in and find in a really good kick and snare or whatever that you have in your library that might be your favorite, but for me, I make all my drums from scratch. I don't always make all my drums from scratch, but yeah. All of these drums that I've used within this track are either from this loop or from something that I've resampled in the past. And all of the stuff, including these glitches that you might hear, I already have videos on how to make that stuff, but this is just kind of how I use that in context. And again, we are going to go through individually, but we're going to talk about workflow first. The only thing that I haven't talked about in this track is the Superior Drummer 3. And this is just an overheads processing chain that I have that I'll do in a separate video. Don't forget about it. I'll try not to forget about it, but that's the only thing that I may have not covered within my YouTube series. So the way that I kind of try to come up with ideas is I'll always start with my kick and snare first, and I'll just come up with something simple. So as you can tell, I have a drum section, and then I have my main section, which is my kicks and collections of snares, and then I have my percussion, which is sidechained to the kick and snare of the main. And that's kind of like how I do everything. So it's a group within a group within a group. But this allows me to stay organized and be able to find everything pretty efficiently. So I know that it says that there's like 18 tracks on here, 19 tracks, 18 tracks within this, but all it really is just chopped up versions of that sample that I've come out with. So in regards to making some of this stuff, starting with the kick and snare first, I'll generally try to come up with a relatively simple pattern that sounds pretty cool. This particular song is in a 6/4 time signature, so it already has a triplet feel. And before I do anything, like instead of making an 8-bar loop, I will literally start with one bar. And I will start adding in all of the other elements. So I'll start with that, and then I'll go into the percussion and start adding that stuff, and then so forth, before I even start doing this stuff. And the reason why is because if you have one bar that sounds really good, then it's very easy to duplicate the rest of them. Does that make sense? Within that, I have my kick and my snare, my rim shot, my ghost snares, and my kick, and the only thing that I've done to these, other than gain stage them a bit, is just EQ them. And it's kind of nice too, because if you spend time making your drums sound good from the get-go, then you don't really have to spend a bunch of plug-in CPU real estate to do all this stuff. You can kind of just throw them in and treat them like crap. So with the kick, one thing that I have done is I've made a transient shaper that is toning down the kick a little bit, because without it, it can be kind of sharp. You might not hear it if you're wearing headphones, but whenever I was playing this in my car, I was like, that's a little bit overboard. So I'm just barely taking off some of the tail. And then you'll see here that I have some fades on the snare to do that as well. So when I was first making this, I started with this snare and then added in a fade. And then I just copied this. But when I went back to fix the kick, I'd have to go back and fix all of these kicks. So that's why I added in the transient shaper as opposed to doing it this way. So this was a choice that I made way later down the line to kind of like band-aid it. It's not the best fix, but it works. So yeah, here's our main section on its own. And again, these collections of sounds are all from the same loop. So now that I have my main section, I don't do any processing within the main section itself. I have done it in the past, but I generally don't. The only thing that I have going on the percussion is sidechaining to the main, which I should make 2 compressors and do one to the kick and one to the snare. That's a little bit less, but that is a mixing thing that I learned after I made this tune. So yeah, from here on out, most of this stuff that's in purple, sorry, like the dark purple, is the same loop, just I've done different things to mostly the snare, or I've taken out the hi-hats. So what I mean by that is, on this one, this is called Other Reverb. I've taken that snare rim shot and added some reverb to it. And then halfway through that sample, I reversed it. And I think the reason why I chopped this here is because I wanted to take out the transient of it. Yeah, I just turned it down a bit. That's all. But that will still transition back into the snare itself. Then on this one, I have done the exact same thing, but I've pitched the snare up and then added more reverb to it. And you'll notice that what I've done is, on one instance here, I've created a long one and then I've done a short one. So if we listen to that in context, let's listen from 19. And the reason why I've done that here is because I've left space in order for the in order for the bass to clear in. So it's still there, but it cuts out pretty quickly, and that kind of gives it more of like a techie, glitchy feel. But anytime that I'm doing like a bass that I want to highlight, I try to take out the rest of the elements for that. So you can see I had some of this other stuff, and I've muted that. So during that bass hit, there's pretty much nothing else going on other than, I think that this is this is just a reverb hit to kind of like, boom. And the reason why I generally do that, even if I'm leaving space, I leave something that is like I don't want to say a cliffhanger, but something that will lead you back into the groove, because if I just have silence on this and you don't hear it at all, to me it doesn't really have as much of an effect. You want to try to create that impact, and a lot of times whenever you're doing like a bass stab like that, like having that impact of like it will lead back into the groove. And I think that I have a reverse on here. Yeah, so after that bass hit is finishing, this is leading. That's a reverse kick back into the groove to kind of help keep you in the pocket. And that's kind of like what I like to do these like shortening things from. Sorry, that was a really long description for why I do that kind of stuff, but yeah. All right, so I have already bounced this out to audio, but all I've done was pitch the sample up when I was working on this, which is the snare sample, and then added some reverb to it and then started cutting the tails off. And again, like I said, working in audio is really cool because you can do that kind of thing. I guess you can technically automate this, which you'll see me do in atmospheres, but whenever I'm working with something that is on, off, on, off, on, off, I don't really want to do that much automation. Next up we have our triplets, which is a closed hat and an open hi-hat, and this is actually the same sample loop from the blue one above. I've just kind of color coordinated it On this one we have a closed hi-hat. There is a reverse sample right there. You probably can't even tell in the actual song, but when I'm making this and like the only thing that I'm listening to is the drums, something that you might notice is I tend to get bored very easily, so I like to have all of these little intricacies that kind of like only I can tell whenever I listen to the song. But going back and listening to it again, you might be able to hear it, which is kind of cool. So this one is an open hi-hat, and I've done a little bit of volume automation between the two, so you can see that this one is a little bit off, and then this one is a little bit louder, and I believe that, yeah, I didn't even do any EQing to it because I EQ'd it whenever I made the drum loop. So yeah, this next section is pretty cool. We have our noise that I'll do, and I'll generally do that on the downbeat or like on the in-between. And what that is just a collection of white noise. It's a layer. I made it in Serum. I literally just turned on the white noise oscillator in Serum and then bounce this out. But what's giving it that neat little, I guess, effect is using an auto pan on a super fast rate. That gives it some stereo. And then this one is just a kind of like more solid, but with a bit of chorus. So you get this really nice like effect that kind of accentuates like the beat is coming at you, and it has a little bit more impact. So we'll go into the next one, which are my glitch lines. Now within my glitch lines, these are two different sample loops. So if I double click this and then open this up, you can tell that this is just a bunch of randomness. And what I'll do is, again, in a different sound design project, I'll just make a bunch of glitch stuff. And then what I'll do is I'll throw this on and then just take little snippets of it and kind of fish around for some of those cuts that I like. But this part isn't actually even really necessary within the drum groove in itself. If I take out this element and leave everything else on, it still should be cohesive. But these little glitches in between kind of give it that neat little texture that's almost like a signature to my sound. So you'll hear me do this a lot in every single song in that EP and most of the other tracks that I ever come out with if I'm not doing like lo-fi hip-hop. And I have a lot of fun with this section here because there's so many different variations of sound, and I will literally just spend way too much time like cutting this up and then focusing on like changing the warping section. So on this one, like I've done left it on beats and then done it on 1/16 and on 32 or whatever, and that just kind of cuts it every 16th note as opposed to, so it will kind of like, I guess, cut the transient shorter, and it can also give you a stutter effect as well if everything is in time. But you'll see me like this one is pitched, this one is also on that timing, this one is reversed. I've added in some warp modes, which sounds pretty cool, but it's just like these little things that add a little bit more character to your drum beats. But none of this was literally planned. Like this was all just trial and error, and of like, oh, I like that sound, oh, I like that sound, and it all comes from those glitchy cuts. So it looks like from here what I'll do is I will make an 8-bar loop, and then I will change it or add in some variation. And even though the drum patterns from section A to B are mostly the same, there's a couple of little different like nuances that kind of just add in a little bit more uniqueness to each section, as if the sections themselves weren't enough. And generally what I'll do is like I'll have an intro that's 16 bars long, and then I will drop like the hardest bass thing that I possibly can, which in this case is and then I'll go into a melodic section. And then I'll have some kind of bridge that may or may not have drums. So the main section 1A and the main section 1B are all relatively similar, and then I just made some slight different like kick snare changes on this. And yeah, that's mostly it as far as the main stuff goes. So yeah, this I did not talk about, but this is pretty much my tops section. Generally what I'll do is I'll pull up Superior Drummer and then just kind of like pencil in and then do this overheads processing, which again I'll talk about in the future, but this is what these sound like, which is mostly just a collection of hats, but I do have a high pass snare with a lot of reverb in there that kind of adds to the other reverb. And together with all of those sounding, or all of those hitting at once, as long as the main transient on here is pretty clean, then you can get a really nice, and I like that too, because as you can tell, like the snares are in different pitches, so it's almost like you're creating a chord snare. I don't do this all the time, but it kind of just worked out for this video. Yeah, sounds nice in my opinion. And that is pretty much what I do with all my drums. So again, the large majority of this stuff is just a cutting up and splitting into its own track of the loop that I made from Superior Drummer 3. And then on all of this other stuff, I've just kind of resampled and added in little hits and bits, and then I have this like glitch line that gives it a little bit more character. And then finally for the shuffle on top, I've done Superior Drummer 3 with a little bit of processing here. And together with all that combined, they kind of create this like neat little drum groove that is mostly consistent throughout the entire track. There are a couple of different instances, but I don't really change a whole lot in between. What might change the most is the shuffle on top, but as you can tell, I've used like a reverse thing here in this section, which I believe is the circus part of the song. But you can tell that the main feel of the drums hasn't really changed a whole lot. The biggest change that I have that I'd say is in the main section 3, which is like the Castlevania part that just has like a little bit more, that has the most energy. But as you can tell, in between these hits, like I have the most ghost snares and a lot more kicks, but it's still the same samples and then more hats as well. There's a nice little like quad section right there that sounds pretty cool. Yeah, that's pretty cool. But for the most part, these drums are relatively consistent. I haven't added any new drum samples that are different from the other section, other than maybe using different cuts of the glitches, but you can tell that it's still relatively consistent throughout the entire track. I have done stuff like in Nightmares, I used a different drum kit. Well, I say I used a different drum kit, but I used the same one and then I pitched it down by 12 notes. So when I did that hip hop part that was kind of like offbeat, I just took the drum kit and then threw it in a sampler and then played it at a really low pitch that I banged out on my push 2. But as you can tell, like everything is relatively consistent. So anyways, that's how I made the drums on this, and I've kind of like hopefully shed some light of how I organize this together. As a final recap, if you're still here watching this video, do your sound design in a different project, and then what you'll do is you'll chop up that loop that you made, and then you can kind of take those samples, create a 1-bar loop that sounds really good, duplicate that, add in variations. Then from that 8-bar, you can duplicate that again and add in any other variations that you want. And once you have like your 8-bar loop that sounds really amazing, that you're really lost and don't know what to do with it, duplicate it again and then add in more variation. You're basically using the idea of resampling in one way or another to create more and more content for your track. Does that make sense? Because again, we've all been here where you just have this 8-bar loop and it's like, and you're literally sitting there for 3 days trying to figure out what to do with it. So make those creative decisions. If you have something that is usable already, duplicate it and start messing with it, and I guarantee it will help you lead to a different, how do I say, like another part of your track. That's pretty much how I do my drums. We'll be going over the other stuff as well. I guess the next part would be the bass, but thank you guys for sitting through that entire section. If you guys have any questions, comments, or observations, be sure to leave it in the comment section, or feel free to DM me or whatever. Hopefully I was pretty thorough in what I was going through. I know that I had a ton of stuff to cover, but I just wanted to give you a general synopsis of how to do stuff with the sounds that I make in my tutorial videos. And in this case, I wanted to cover the very first video that I put out, which is how to make hard-hitting drums that are in the style of neuro or whatever. And this is kind of what came about. So even though it's not like It's not Audica heavy or Noisia heavy. You can still get some great sounds just by doing the same kinds of processing. If it sounds good, then it sounds good. In this case, this is one of my favorite tracks that I've ever made. So yeah, thank you guys for watching my content, and happy producing.